Howdy folks out there on the internet, putting out my glasses. We're starting right now at the Floating Mountain Tea House here in Manhattan, where we're going to be enjoying some powdered tea tonight. These will be my recreations of Song period style matcha for those who speak Japanese. And we'll be going through some of the history of the Song period and the myriad of different types of teas during that time. Stay tuned, stick around, watch, learn, be thirsty, be curious, make some tea. Oh, and if you need the slides to the presentation that we'll be walking through, you'll find those at scotttea.wordpress.com. I think that's it. So feel free to check those out. It's a PDF at the moment, and it's a rough draft, so enjoy that for what it is. There will be more to come. All right, get ready, put your tea hats on. We'll see you soon. Woohoo, technology. By which I mean rubber bands. Right. This is how it's done in Manhattan. You can hear me. We've got a fan on, so if there's any sort of like weird hum or background noise, blame the fan. It's a warm day, so welcome all. Welcome to History in a Bowl of Tea. This is our second installment of History in a Bowl of Tea. Previously, when we conducted the first round, History in a Bowl of Tea was looking at 6,000 years of tea history. It was ambitious, it was highly caffeinated. We started with tea before we could even call it tea. That's tea as a sort of medicine, all right? It was a folk medicine before it was an actual beverage to be enjoyed, consumed alongside with things like green onions, salt, various dried herbs. We consumed that tea that night. It was doing boiling tea over direct heat to the point where it reached a full boil and adding those components into it. After that, we did the Tang Dynasty style tea, which, mind you, none of these teas I'd ever done. It had all just been tea in a book prior to this. And so it was us then trying to reproduce a Tang Dynasty style tea as was written by Lu Yu in some of the text on tea, the Cha Jing or the Cha Qing or the classic of tea, where he talks about tea moving out of a medicinal form and into a beverage. So interesting. For those who were there, they might say the word bitter or medicinal bitter. In Chinese, you call it ku. We add a little bit of salt. The salt actually helps. It was very interesting.
Salt in the liquid?
Into the tea, yeah. Similar, it actually tasted very similar to if you've ever had like Tibetan butter tea. It's very savory. They put things like fermented drays milk or yak's milk into it. And so it's interesting. Still not, I would say, not recognizably tea to many people who are used to the sort of like boom fu style tea or the sort of Western style of tea where you're, making tea as a steeped item. We were still boiling the tea at that point. The foam that Lu Yu talks about in the Tang Dynasty is literally sort of the foam that comes when you mix the tea into the boiling water, and it kind of creates this, I don't want to call it scum, that's a terrible thing to call it, but it's a foam.
Different from like the matcha foam that forms, more like a stuff you don't want.
Well, it marks that, oh, it's ready kind of foam. So, yeah, it's interesting. And then after that, we started getting into the Song period. And soon I realized, and then soon we kind of realized collectively around the table, that this really needed a sort of sit-down session of its own. And really to dig into a period in Chinese history and in the history of art and the history of science and the history of really food and beverage appreciation that was really blossoming. And it was the first time that tea was consumed as a singular beverage, a time that they stopped putting things into the tea, where we were just having the leaf itself, and where tea became slightly recognizable or more recognizable to folks who might be more familiar with things like matcha. And that's what we're going to dig into today. That last time we continued on into the Ming, we continued on into the Qing, and into sort of modern interpretations of tea. But again, tonight we're going to kind of take one step back so we can kind of dig into this thing that we know as Song Dynasty tea, and try to locate that. And we'll get to try some of Crazy Scott's sort of versions of Song tea. I just to sort of add as a footnote, part of what we're doing tonight is tasting and sort of testing experiments that I've been conducting in the last couple of months on grinding tea, getting tea ready for consuming in a way that's familiar, or would have been, let's say, familiar to folks during the Song period. Again, we're not dealing with leaf teas, we're dealing with teas that are powdered, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. So before we jump into that, I want to kind of go through a slideshow, if that's okay. I would have projected it on the wall. We can still project it on the wall if the projector shows up. Hello. I was trying to find the projector, but I didn't find it.
Yeah.
Oh, is that what it is? Okay. All right. We'll figure it out.
I put it out for you.
Okay. All right.
Want me to grab it?
Is that okay? Do we want to set it up now? Okay. Sweet. Thank you. Thank you. People live on the internet get to see me attempt to set up a projector. This is very exciting. I'm live. I think I'm live. So, oh yes, everything that we see shall be recorded. You okay with being live, you guys? I know we didn't have you guys sign a waiver or anything like that. So, if this doesn't work out, if this is crazy, I will simply discontinue. Extension cord. I might run it through here. If not, we'll figure it out.
If you use in one kettle, there is one behind you.
I have the phone plugged in.
One kettle, one behind you.
But,
you can plug the phone in here.
Will it reach?
Huh? Yeah.
It will? Okay.
Wow.
continuation of this tea talk that I'm going to do, at least as it is a sort of presentation form. For the folks who are online, they can see this if they go to scottt.wordpress.com. This is my dainty little blog that I've put up. You'll find it as a PowerPoint presentation. No, as a PDF. And I hope it works. Is this working?
It has to be mentioned to work.
It might also just be that my computer screen is on. I feel like there's a little thing working. Is it this light that's coming from? Okay. So excited. And then, what do we do at this point? There we go. All right, so this will be kind of an interaction slideshow, I guess we'll say. As things come up, I might begin to pull some things out for us to see. Conversely, what I'll do is afterwards, we'll kind of do the same thing. What this slideshow is going to kind of take you through is, in a nutshell, tea in the Song period. That's why we're all here. But it's also going to talk about the general history of the Song period, tea development in the Song period, teaware, and kind of, this is literally just tip of the iceberg of what you're seeing out here. And then art and tea in the Song period, and then finally how you go about if you want to do what Crazy Scott did, and that is make your own matcha or ground tea, powdered tea at home. So, without further ado, just want to introduce you to the Song period and to the Song Dynasty. This is a map of Song period China. What we're seeing here, at least on the east side, if we, our right, that's the eastern seaboard of China, going as far west as about Chengdu. Xi'an is somewhere slightly in the middle of there. What we see here is a China that's roughly half the size of modern day China. Of course, Tibet at this time was a major kingdom, and was for many, many centuries a major trade hub for China. When we talk a little bit later about what's called the Chama Dao, which means tea horse ancient road, or the ancient tea horse road, it's largely with the Tibetans that we find as sort of the trading impetus and the sort of major consumer group for tea outside of China at this time. During this time period, and previously we kind of talked about the Tang period and periods prior to the Tang, most of the tea that was being produced would have been produced around this area that we see as Dali, the sort of Dali kingdom, as well as around Chengdu. We'll get into that a little bit more. But what we see in the Song dynasty of the circa 1100s is the Song dynasty at kind of its apex. They were using tea, they were using sort of their versions of ancient technology, as well as attempting to keep trade in their favor and keep folks like the Zhichen, or the Tangut, or the Khitan. These are various kingdoms on the outskirts of Song dynasty China, keeping them at bay. They failed to do that, and some people might say tea was maybe a problem, tea was maybe the cause of this. I'm not going to say that, but you do see the collapse of what is called the Northern Song Dynasty, and the forming of what's called the Southern Song Dynasty, and that's when you see the Kingdom of Jin and Western Xia move down into what was the Song, and pushing the court further south. And it's during this time period that you do actually see tea culture continues to thrive, and what we'll see later in sort of kind of the visualizations or the sort of visual culture that follows tea, again, kind of reaches its apex in the Southern Song. Teaware, especially, a lot of people say is at its sort of highest in the Southern Song. That's up to personal preference, though. This is a map that I mocked up of showing. Let's make sure that this is fairly clear. This is a map that shows famous tea production areas in the Song period, and this is going to be kind of a historical map. So as we look at things populating on this, we'll find that they're kind of historically and sort of chronologically arranged. What I want you to see, though, is on the sort of southwestern edge, where you see Yunnan and Dali, you see a red dotted line. It's a little hard to see because it's kind of bright in here. But that red dotted line is the sort of furthest east that the Chawan Dao reaches into China. And the Chawan Dao, again, was this massive tea and horse trading network where Chinese tea merchants were sending tea into places like Nepal, places like Tibet, and trading it largely for horses. And these horses were the horses of Mustang, very mountainous region, and these were the horses that were being used largely to outfit the military. So it's like, let's trade our great sort of trade product, i.e. tea, for this really important technology, i.e. horses. So there are other things that were traded too. And along the Chawan Dao, even to this day, you see a mishmash of cultures. A lot of them are a sharing of Chinese, Tibetan, Nepalese, and various Central Asian sort of cultural affects. It's during this time period that you start seeing not only the increase in trade along the Chawan Dao, but also it becoming a major sort of economic generator for the Song, to the point where it slightly gets out of hand in the late 1000s, 1100s, leading to what I would say is a collapse in a tea market, kind of similar to like a dot-com bust. It just got too intense, not sustainable. So kind of looking at the various different types of teas that we see, I'm going to roll this down just so we can read it. What we see on you got it. What we see on this is very, very old production areas for tea that date back pre-Tang Dynasty, and they're marked in red. The types of teas that you would see being produced along here are what we would today kind of call pour. These were teas that were pressed into cakes, but they were pressed into cakes so that they would travel well and that they would retain a slight hint of their original sort of greenness as a green tea. So think like a shengpuer. These are green, still kind of raw pours that we drink today. That is a very, very bad generalization, because to call these anywhere close to what we consider a pour is rather silly. But just think that these are teas that are being picked, lightly processed, pressed into cakes, pressed into bamboo tubes, packed into baskets, and then being loaded onto horses and being sent out upon the Chama. These teas, and if you can see here, we have them in areas like Sichuanbana on the lowest south here, an area which today we'll call Pu'er or Simao. This is a major area for tea production, really not production, but sort of bringing the tea into the trade routes. And the reason why we call Pu'er the pressed tea cakes Pu'er is because this city of Pu'er was this hub of tea. It's kind of like saying Genoa salami, and we think of the city of Genoa. Well, that salami didn't come from Genoa; it came from Milan, but it came through Genoa. They stamped it Genoa, so people here, at least in the United States, think of Genoa salami being a salami with background being in Genoa. Other areas are Linsan, Boshan. And then further north in what is modern-day Sichuan is Ya'an. Ya'an is one of the original, let's call it Chinese tea, Han-Chinese tea production areas. Back in the Bashun state, in pre-Tang period, there was tea production going on there. There's still, in all of these areas, tea production is still going on. Using many of the cultivars that were originating from this time period, from the Tang and Song. When we kind of go a little bit further in time, this is right at the sort of midpoint of the Tang period, so like 600s, 700s. We have the growth of tea in Sichuan, in what used to be the Bashu state. Ba is kind of around modern-day Chongqing, to kind of give you a sense of where that is. It's a city, major city that's just southeast of Chengdu. So you have famous areas like Yimeishan, which today is very well known for their green teas, Mengdingshan, Qingchenshan, and Bashan. All of these are still producing green teas to this day. At this time, they were almost exclusively producing tea that was consumed in the area around them, but also being consumed by folks in the Chawan Tea Bowl, the tea horse road. It was only later in the Tang that people like Lu Yu began to recognize the quality of these teas beyond what they were as a medicine and began to drink them as a beverage. And what we see here on the East Coast, the Guzuzang, is an area that was recognized by contemporaries of Lu Yu. And this is in this sort of Suzhou region near Lake Tai. Yeah.
So during this period, what would have been like the capital of that area? Chengdu, or?
So it depends on the state that you're talking about. Chengdu was one of the capitals at that time.
Or was it like a central?
So during the Tang period, one of the capitals was Xi'an, which is kind of central China. I don't even think it's on this map right now for some reason. But kind of give you a sense of where it might be. It's right around here. So, and that was kind of at the hub of what was the Silk Road during that time period. During the Song period, you had a series of moving capitals. I'm gonna mess this up for sure, but I think Nanjing was one of them, Kaifeng was another one, and then you had a series of capitals further south as well when you had the dissolution of the Song dynasty into the southern Song. I know people online are going to rip me apart for that.
So would it be the case that they would select the best teas to go to those areas,
yes.
or were they just mostly exported?
So in the Tang period, you had a little bit of that making its way into the court. You had the beginnings of what they call a tribute tea. Tribute teas were kind of sent like a surrogate for tax. So if you're a tea farmer, or if you're a region that has tea as a major sort of product, that ends up going into your sort of tax docket. Later during the Song period, though, they start regulating that, and places that would produce tea would produce tribute cakes. And those would go to the capital, and then if you were connected in any way to the government, you might somehow get your hands on some of that tribute too. So that's where, during the Song period, that's a kind of good segue, you start seeing, there's also hei cha that's being produced as well. I have further down the south in Guangxi, we have Lu Bao cha. This is kind of showing you an outlier. There are a lot of other hei chas that are being produced, but the early versions of hei cha are being produced on that sort of nebulous border between Laos, Vietnam, Burma, Myanmar, and Nepal. But when you get into the Song period, you begin seeing what are called tribute teas. Gujusan was one of the areas where they were beginning to produce tribute teas. Beiyuan is an area that is now sort of the early precursor to Yishan tea, where we now have Yancha. These are the sort of darker oolongs of the Wu Mountains. They had a tea farm there in Beiyuan, largely as a result of frosts that hit a tea farm further north, which was the Imperial Tea Farm. When they closed that, they moved tea production to Beiyuan. These were teas that were being produced for tribute, or as a form of tribute. Also, consequently, these were areas where tea was also being produced for, if you were a wealthy merchant or a wealthy scholar, if you were part of let's say like a temple group. Buddhist temples during this time were large consumers of tea. It was during the Tang period that we saw an influx of Buddhism in the south, up through to the major cities in China. It was during the Song period that we really began to see the explosion of what we call Zen Buddhism or Chan Buddhism. It was there previously, but was beginning to not only influence China proper, but also beginning to influence places like Korea and Japan. And it was also during this period that you have a very, very strong link between Buddhism and tea, largely because tea was the thing that you were drinking to keep you awake. It was also seen as a sort of means to get your daily vitamins. It was also a way of getting other sort of health properties into your body. It was, at this point during the Song, a beverage, but it still had medicinal properties. So what we see in Beiyuan and what we see in what is now modern day Chaozhou are the production of famous tea cakes. What we would call Longfan Tuancha, which literally just means dragon phoenix cake tea. Tuancha is a sort of means round tea or sort of like gathered or compressed tea. And these were cakes that would then, as we'll learn, be ground down into powder. Teas that you would see further west, like in the Yunnan Dali area or the Sichuan area, modern day Sichuan area, these were also being compressed into cakes, but my guess is that a lot of these were not being whipped into the sort of foamy sort of matcha broth that we see. Maybe some of them were, but a lot of these were still being consumed in the sort of boiled tea style, which if you go to some of these regions, especially in areas like Sichuan, that's how they're still drinking this tea to this day. So, and then what we see here highlighted in yellow are famous areas, kind of ancient and modern areas of tea production. Wu Yishan, as I mentioned, is sort of the sort of result of tea farming in what was called Beiyuan, or the sort of North Garden or North Park. Yongchen is a famous region for tea at this time, would later end up producing sort of greener version of, or early versions of oolong. And Anxi County, which today we know as sort of the birthplace of Tiaguanyan, which is a style of green oolong, was at this period during the Song a area of tea production, but was not necessarily as famous as Beiyuan or Fenghuanshan, where they were producing these cake teas. So, any questions on that? Because it's a lot to take in.
I have a question. So
Yeah, please.
was tea native to those areas as well, or it was brought?
That's a great question. Tea was probably native to these areas. My guess is what you saw, however, were teas that were either being brought over from that sort of Laos, Burma, Sichuan area, either through as a seed, or what you would see is people taking native tea plants and raising them like you would those tea plants down in Sichuan. I don't have actually that answer for you. I do know as tea makes its way to places like Korea and Japan, they're doing it by bringing seeds. So my guess is that it might be similar.
Somebody stole the seeds, right?
So we'll get to this story. It's a cool story when we get into the sort of teaware aspect of tea and tea history. But tea at that time was oftentimes coming literally on the backs or in the sort of rucksacks of Buddhist monks. In the case of Japan, it happened twice. First during the sort of Tang period, Nara period of Japan, 9th century, where you have a series of Buddhist monks bringing tea there and producing tea in the Japanese archipelago in a similar fashion to what you would see during Tang period China. So it was still being boiled, though ground. That's our guess. When you get to the later part of the Song period, you have a huge influx of Buddhist monks who originated in Japan, were learning in China, and then bringing back that version of Buddhism to Japan. In the case of one monk by the name of Myoan Eisai, in the late, let's say 1100s, it was 1191, he brings back tea seeds, and he plants them on the sort of hills of Fuji, which are mountains outside of Kyoto. They still produce tea there, and what he brought with him not only were these seeds and the know-how of how to produce tea, but also he brought a kind of, let's call it Buddhist version of tea practice. And a lot of folks say that that's where we have sort of the beginnings of what we can call a tea ceremony in Japan. I'm not going to say it's the beginning of tea ceremony as we know it, but it was the beginning of the popularization of taking tea and doing so with a slight hint towards Buddhism. And that's what you would have seen in China at this time period as tea becomes a daily beverage, not just something that you would have as a medicine, not just something as you would have, if you were a bunch of scholars hanging out, it was everybody drinking tea. And the boom of tea houses in China was seen at this time period, largely because of what you saw during the Tang.
Was it 12th century?
12th century, yeah. From the 10th to the 13th century, for looking at the long version of this. Further kind of looking, I added a couple of other things here. The Anji Bai Cha, which is a modern name that we've given to a green tea, and then the Wu Yan Gong Cha. Anji Bai Cha is, during the Song period, we have the emergence of a tea that's called Bai Cha. In modern day terms, that would mean, or in a basic translation, that means white tea. This tea, however, was not white. It's not white like what we would think of like a fuding bai cha, but it was in fact a very, very young green tea. And during the sort of later Song period, what we see is the preference within the higher elites of a very, very young tea leaf to be pressed into these tea cakes. And what we'll find from that is the further refining into, let's just pick the tiny little buds. These buds will have little white hairs on them, and we'll call that bai cha. It isn't white tea as we know it today. I won't even call it a precursor to that, but what you end up getting from making tea out of that is something that people during this time period favored. Anji Bai Cha is being made up in Zhejiang, and then the Wu Yuan Gong Cha is Gong Cha just means tribute tea, and that's being made further south. And that's an area that became very famous for these sort of pressed, let's call them green tea cakes at that time period. Just to kind of put it into perspective, modern day white teas like Fuding Bai Cha and Zhenghe Bai Cha are further south in Fujian. But it is during this time period that we do see the sort of preeminence of Fujian teas, as well as the sort of border state of Chaozhou, where we have these early growth of tea in places like Phoenix Mountains. So, yeah. And this is a draft of this map. So there's going to be more on this the further down I keep researching this. So, kind of give you a sense of what these teas look like. What we have here is a contemporary produced dokcha, or compressed tea cake. Completely forgot to bring one today. They're kind of fun. They're about this big. In Korea, they call them twancha. If you find them in these little cake shapes, it means coin tea. And they're literally teas that have been, imagine, I have it here somewhere. Tea leaves go in, some dude, usually a Buddhist monk. You find these on Buddhist monasteries in Korea to this day. They basically just pound the tea into a sort of pulp, and then press that into oftentimes a little mold, and then that they'll hang up to dry. So these little holes that you see here are where they put a sort of bamboo cord through, and then they hang that up to dry. They do a light, I'm not going to call it a roasting, but it's kind of like a dry heat that they apply to this, and that just helps to dry this out. The shape and size is important to note because it's during the Tang period that we start seeing the development of tea like this, and it was because tea was becoming more and more of a trade commodity that it became itself a form of currency. So to see a tea in the shape of a coin kind of harks back to that. If you turn around, you'll see this rather large tea cake here, and that is in the shape of a Chinese coin. And these you kind of give away for like presentation and decoration. But what's cool about that too is that the sort of embossing that you see on this particular cake is actually similar to the embossing that you would see on a Song Dynasty cake. We'll kind of look at that too. So, do you have any white tea cakes? Okay. I wanted to make mention of Luan black tea or Luan hei cha at this point too. I just wanted you to see that beyond being pressed into cakes, teas were also being packed into baskets. Again, this is something that probably occurred before the Tang period, but continues in the Tang period, continues up to this day. If you go to the city of Luan, this is the style of tea that they're producing. But you find this throughout China, and it is what we now call hei cha, but it's essentially a tea that's been allowed to fully oxidize and then ferment. It is what we would call a sort of inoculated tea. They use sort of the latent flora in the air to aid in the fermentation of these teas. So originally you would have seen teas like this again in sort of the Guangxi and Yunnan border. So,
This is Moonlight White by Modan and Shoni. Can you try it here?
oh, sure. I brought incense too, if you guys want incense. So, kind of going into those embossed cakes, what we have here are the Longfen Tuancha, or at least images of them. The one that you see on your right is from what's called the Suku Chan Shu, which is the sort of four treasuries of knowledge in the Qing Dynasty. But they have in that, so Qing Dynasty is, at least in this case, this was written in the 18th century, so 1770s. But what they're showing here is kind of an encyclopedia of historical forms. What they're showing are Song Dynasty tea cakes. So the one that you see up here is what we call a Xiaofeng, or the little phoenix. And then you have here on the other side the Dalong, or the big dragon. And what these are referring to are tea cakes that were produced in Fujian that would range anywhere from, let's say, the size of, just gonna make it with my hands, about maybe yay big, right? So maybe like 4 inches, 6 inches across, to something that is a little bit more like a modern day pu'er. If you want to see, I don't know if you've ever seen white tea that's been pressed into a cake. This is slightly anachronistic to do this because, again, the tea that they would use would not be white tea, but if you want to just get a sense of what a tea cake would look like, they made them smaller than this too. But what we're seeing here, and what's kind of cool to look at that, is imagine those teas being compressed into an embossed cake like this. There are steps that go in between from when the tea is picked to when the tea is pressed into a cake. A lot of that comes down to picking the leaves and then steaming the leaves and then compacting the leaves into cake form. That's just getting it into the cake. So after which we as tea drinkers have to go through even more steps to bring that tea into consumable form. So you can already see why at some point, specifically during the Ming period, do you see them wanting to move away from having all of our teas and cakes to let's cut out a lot of that after production and just use the loose leaf. So it took about let's say 700 years roughly to get it from hey let's pack all of our teas into cakes to let's actually move away from that. So and here are some other forms of famous cakes. These would have been tribute tea cakes. So just a look. And as you can see, on each one of them you see dragons, on some you see phoenixes. Some scholars believe this is actually where we get the term wulong from having tea cakes embossed with dragons on them. So long being dragon, wulong being sort of black crow dragon. So wonton. This is a modern day reconstruction or reproduction of a Longfen Tuancha. What's kind of fun about modern day China is that a lot of tea people are getting really excited about Song Dynasty tea, and they're kind of doing their own reinterpretations of this, to the point that now when I do research on Song Dynasty tea, half of it is just sifting through modern day interpretations of what Song Dynasty tea is. What we're going to be drinking today is honestly a modern day interpretation, because as much as we want to reproduce to an exactitude what we want to drink from this time period, it's near impossible, I'll say. They do write about it, we can try our best, but it's not easy. During the Song period too, we have the emergence of famous kilns that kind of help to celebrate tea. What we see here I'm just going to kind of go around, is the famous, there's no particular order here, maybe just kind of creating a pinwheel. There's Royale, which is this sort of lustrous, what do we want to call it? Celadon, crackly Celadon. There's Junyao, which is this very sort of flamboyant purple, blue, red glaze that they put on oftentimes like a light bisque. There's Yao Zhou Yao, which is oftentimes seen as an incised Celadon, sometimes brownware, like a light tan brown. Jizo Yao, which is a brown blackware. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Jian Yao, which is the Jian Yao bowl here, which we'll drink tea out of very soon. Longchuan Qingxi, which is very, very famous during this period as a producer for Celadon, and I brought a Vietnamese reproduction of one of these bowls so we can see that later. Guanyao, which is white and black crackleware. This is kind of Guanyao-esque if you want to pass that around. Again, this is looking at cups like this, you can kind of see why, like, not only forms are preserved, but also, you know, this is a contemporary cup. People still bring the same level of care and attention to producing wares as they would have back then, and now we're doing that on a mass production to meet the needs of people who are still really enamored with Song period style wares. And then this is Yue Yao or Yue Zhou Yao, Zhou Yao, sorry. And then Si Zhou Yao, which is like highly carved and decorated black and white ware. All of these, by the way, everything that you see here on this slide, these are all teaware. So not only did they make teaware, they did other things, but teaware was one of the many things that they made. Some of these also were from imperial kilns, so kilns that specifically made wares to be sent directly to the emperor. So probably the most famous out of these for imperial ware is the Royale, which is in this sort of 11 o'clock corner there. So kind of taking a step back and just kind of wanting to situate you into Song period tea production is this page from the Chaju Tuzan, which is literally just means pictorial of tea, produced in the late Song period. This is depicting all of the wares that you would need to make tea, all right? So imagine today we just have our loose leaf tea, we have our gaiwan, our teapot, water, you're done, right? During the Song Dynasty, things were not so simple. Not to rip on the Song Dynasty, but we'll talk about sort of how each one of these is used, or at least highlighting a select few, because not only do we continue to use these to produce Song Dynasty tea today, but also we'll see how these are being used by folks during the Song Dynasty. So first off, this is a version of a tea grinder, all right? If you go into a Chinese medicine shop, an old school style Chinese medicine shop, you might still see something like this. It's a trough that's made out of either metal or wood or ceramic, and then this discus that you roll in that trough. And whatever you put into that trough, through the action of rolling this discus over, not only do you cut the material that's in there, but also you begin to break it down. This here is a dingware, which is like a very sort of pure white, almost Celadon, ceramic glazed tea grinder, and you can kind of imagine there would have been a dowel that would sit in the middle of that sort of donut that you see, and this allows you to break down the tea leaves. This is from the Northern Song. What we see here is a famous painting of a literary gathering. So you see kind of folks hanging out in the sort of center here, all around a very large table, and enjoying various things. This is kind of the Song Dynasty version of what we would call today as like a dim sum, or literally, if you want to be very literal, it would be what we'd call a young cha in Cantonese. It's the act of sitting and drinking tea and eating small food. What we see, however, kind of tucked away on the bottom register is people making tea. So kind of as a supplement, almost, you might say, to this feast that's happening. And if you really look in the sort of corners of this, you see a guy's playing a guqin, and then you see these two dudes kind of hanging out with this tree, probably talking about something. But what we see here, and what you'll oftentimes see in Chinese paintings upwards to the Qing dynasty, is that tea doesn't necessarily take center stage. It's oftentimes pushed off to the side. If you're a noble person, if you're a literati, you're not the one who's making tea. You're the one who's enjoying tea. You set people up to make tea for you. And it's kind of like having your, literally your servants, your acolytes. Those are the folks who are making tea. So when we talk about things like gongfu cha, the sort of skill acquired by being challenged by the act of making tea, this is what we call nowadays kind of the basis for Chinese tea. The gongfu of tea, the gongfu cha, is more or less what these servants are doing. And in Chinese classical poetry, you might call the literati who's really enjoying tea and bringing all these wares together the sort of charan, the tea person. But really, the people who are making tea were equal to that. They're the ones who have to sort of finesse the process to make excellent tea, which we'll do later when we actually sit down and make tea. So kind of just to give you a sense of where we might find some of those original sort of, what would we say, 12 teaware in that original grid that we showed from the pictorial of tea. Well, if you look close enough, you'll see this ewer. You see it reproduced several times on this table, and that's most likely being carrying water for tea, so hot water for tea. What we see here is what we call a Chawan Tea Bowl. It's literally one of these bowls. If you want to pass that in a sense, we'll look closer at a bowl like this in the slide. And then latter part of the Yuan and the Ming, but you began to stop seeing these, at least in China, during the Ming. You still see these in Japanese tea ceremony, and you see versions of this if you go to places like Tibet, where they present somebody tea. It's usually on a dais like this. So if you want to see it, it comes in 3 parts. I would try to keep it as one thing, but the wooden version of this is, at least in Japanese tea ceremony, where you see these being used still. This would be what you would make tea and serve it to someone if they were a noble person or a literati, wood being slightly more humble than a lacquer version of this, or a silver and gold version of this. What we see here are some beautiful late Song, early Yuan period Qingbai ware. Qingbai ware is probably what you see on this table. Very common during this time. And of course you see the ewer and then this little pumpkin-shaped lobe container, which honestly could be used for anything. Going back to the ewer, this is a beautiful example of an incised ewer from the Northern Song period. This one I believe was up for auction at Christie's a couple of years back when they did a big sort of Song period show. A lot of the wares from that show were specifically teaware, and this would have been one of those. Looking at that sort of register where you're seeing people making the tea, you can see a lot of things going on. One is, we see again our Chawan our tea bowl. We see the sort of die or the sort of platform it's sitting on. In this case, it looks like it's a black lacquer, which during the Song period, lacquer was being heavily used. And then you see here a little image that we see from the pictorial on tea has what is a gourd. It's a sort of like double-lobed gourd. In Chinese, you call it a hulu. But what that really is a dipper or a ladle. So what you see in the image is not that gourd, but it is in fact just the ladle. And what they're probably doing there, that acolyte that's sitting there bending down, he's probably drawing water up from what is probably a well. So it's kind of hard to see. And then further, we see the ewer, several ewers that are sitting about, again, providing water once it's being drawn. And then if you see on the other side of this image, you see a brazier, and you see a gentleman who's kind of cautiously trying to pull the ewers out of the brazier. So these were probably made out of bronze or copper, which would then transfer hot water into something that was made out of ceramic. Looking closer, we see this diǎn, basically an exact version of this, looking down into the tea bowl. At least in the version that you see in the slide, you see what's called hare's fur, and that's a patternation that you get when you bring ceramic, and particularly the glaze of the diǎn kiln into contact with high heat. Some of the highest heats that you can get out of a furnace at this time period you would find at the diǎn kiln, and it creates this sort of iridescent, almost psychedelic kind of patternation here. This one in particular is called hare's fur. You also get partridge feather. You also get oil drop. This is kind of a version of the oil drop. And a whole lot of others. And people write poetry about this. So it's highly appreciative. These are Jizo or Jizhou Yao tea bowls. In this, you'll see different patternations. There's tortoise, there's sort of a splashed glaze, and then sort of the 9 o'clock of this, the far left. You see what is done is sort of a resist pattern where they take oftentimes things made out of paper and apply like a little wax to it and place that onto the bowl right before it's getting glazed, so you get interesting patterns. A good example of this and a little bit more dramatic is this Jizhou Yao tea bowl where they actually just used a leaf. And you get really interesting images from this. So this is one example. I think this one might be in the British Museum. And then looking back at other images, just to kind of show how preeminent tea kind of took place in the art of the Song period. Here we have lohans, or sort of like Buddhist sages, drinking tea, painted during the late 12th century. This is now in Tokyo. But what we see here are lohans, these sages, sitting around, again being served by an acolyte, tea. And what we can see in this image is actually the whisking of tea. So if you look at that guy's hand, he's kind of doing this motion. He's whisking tea. And this is from the tea pictorial whisk. He's pouring liquid into a chawan, and that chawan again sits on one of these dais. And if you're, again, a lohan, if you're a sage, you're being served tea like this because it's a sign of honor to have tea on a little dais like that. What we see here again is the acolyte preparing the tea in the style specific to the Song period, and he's using this little ewer to do that. So And again, kind of give you a one-to-one comparison here. This is what we call a Yodi, black glazed tea bowl. The Yodi refers to the ink, or sorry, the oil drop patternation that we get with these. So you can kind of see it looks like oil on water. That sort of like ripply patternation. And what we see here is it's sitting on a red lacquer container, or a red lacquer, tea bowl stand. This one, just like the bowl that we see here, has a metal ring around the rim. And part of that is because this bowl made the trip all the way to Japan from the Southern Song period, where having a rim like this is more fashionable. They put metal around the edge. But the reason why they do that, there's kind of a good reason. I'll show you, I'll bring out, this is our first sort of historical teaware share, because everything that we've been showing has been reproductions. When you get into the Song period, a lot of these bowls are being fired in what are called sagers. A sager is this sort of clay box, and oftentimes the sager is built right up to the edge of the tea bowl. And the reason why they do that is because they want to create a chamber where you can contain and maximize heat potential on the bowl. And what results because of that, because you have the sager that comes in close contact with the rim of the bowl, is essentially the sort of wearing down of that rim. So drinking tea from those bowls, as enjoyable as it is a little rough on the mouth, and so when you get into places like Japan, they tend to put this metal edge around it. If you remove this metal edge on this, what we call in Japanese tenmoku, or in Chinese tianmu, sort of heavenly eye, which is the sort of patternation that we see here. If you remove this, you'd probably see a rough edge. So it just kind of makes it feel a little bit nicer in the hand and on the mouth. So, what I first passed around was a Qingbai tea bowl. It's in the shape of what you would normally find during the Tang Dynasty. These are very shallow bowls. There's a reason why they're shallow, and that's because people are pouring tea into the bowl. When you get into the Song period, they begin to favor deeper bowls, and that's because you're actually making the tea in the bowl. And you'll see why that's kind of more beneficial to have a shape like that. I'm going to pass around this one. This is kind of like a ding yao or a ge yao piece. Kind of hard to say. What you'll see in that bowl is kind of fun too. There's a rock that was lodged into it some way, somehow during the firing, and produced a kiln error, but it's quite beautiful to use for that reason.
So this is like 800 years old?
That's probably from maybe the 1000s, maybe 900s.
Wow.
Yeah, same with the first one that we saw. Moving on still, we see here, this is a painting called Tea Extraction, Tea Grinding by Liu Songyan. This is Southern Song period, late 1100s, early 1200s. What we see here again is an image really bisected down the middle. Of scholars enjoying scholarly things. In this case, they're doing calligraphy and reading a scroll and probably talking about sort of meanings of life. But what we see on the other side are servants making tea. And in this case, we see a guy grinding tea. Going back to the tea pictorial, we see the tea furnace, this sort of cylinder that we see here with the 3 feet. What we see in the tea pictorial is a very rough drawing of that. If you didn't know, or if it wasn't labeled as such, the name that they give here is actually a poetic name for it, so it doesn't even say tea furnace. But that is the tea furnace that you would use to have a sort of pot placed upon. And then what we see in the corner here, kind of what I think is the star of the show, is this tea grinder. And what's interesting is that this tea grinder is more or less the same thing that you would see nowadays if you went into a matcha factory, or if you were ever at a tea ceremony where they ground the tea before consuming the tea. It is a mill that is made up of two cylindrical drums. One is one that sits on top and rotates as you rotate and grind the tea. And then there's one that sits on the bottom and that has a little catch on the sides of it, so that what you have ground ends up being pushed out from the top where you pour the tea leaves into, goes down the drum, and then begins to be pushed out towards the edges of this sort of bottom collection area. I hope that's a good description, because seeing one of these in real life is very, very cool, and you will understand exactly what I'm talking about once you do. If you've never seen one and you're in New York, go to Setsugeka on in the East Village.
7th Street?
7th Street, yeah. And they have a mechanized version of this, but the mechanized version is literally just the hand version of this with a motor. Because it's either you doing that for 10 minutes to several hours, or it's a motor doing that same amount of time. They're usually made up of a limestone. The reason why you want to use something like limestone is that it's typically very cool to the touch. You don't want the stones to overheat. When they do overheat, you end up basically cooking the tea. It produces a bitter flavor as a result. So, but we see one here in this. And again, this is the late Southern Song period, or the Southern Song period, late Song period. This is something that you would see in the late Song. From what we can tell, and what I need to continue to research on, there were other ways that they would grind tea, of which I'll talk about one, which, take it or leave it, you do get ground tea as a result. Moving further, what we see here is kind of an image that sort of harkens to the popularization of tea. And by popularization, I mean not only are scholars making tea now, but day-to-day people are making tea. To the point where people are beginning to do like tea throwdowns. Similar to like if you go to any town that has like more than 5 or 6 really, really good baristas, you'll see them do their like latte art kind of thing. Not to adulterate it too much, but that's basically what's going on here, is that these guys are like, oh yeah, I'm gonna make the best latte art on my cappuccino. In this case, do away with the latte, do away with cappuccino. What they're doing is what's called diǎn. Diǎn literally means to mark the tea, or to dot the tea. Diǎn is mark, and cha is tea. But what they're doing specifically, not just doing diǎn cha, what they're doing is what's called a dou cha. Dou cha means tea battle or tea competition, and that's when you get a bunch of guys together. I don't want to gender this, but it was mostly men. They would come together and they would try to produce the best looking foam on that tea. So it is very similar to if you go to like a latte art competition. It's kind of what they're doing here. Kind of picking this apart from this tea competition image is we see here a guy very carefully taking his little ewer here and trying to pour it ever so carefully into one of these deep tea bowls. And in this case, this tea bowl is probably a Qingbai or a Yue-ware or Guan-ware tea bowl. We can tell because it's white and because it's lustrous. And he's doing that because there's a certain way that you pour water into the tea bowl when you're doing diǎn cha. And he's being extra careful because he knows he's being judged. So He's being super careful with it. And what's great about the piece that he's using to pour water is that the ewer itself is very good at pouring water in a very exact way, having this sort of gooseneck spout. Prior to the popularization of ewers like that, they tended to have short and stubby spouts, which were not very good at pouring water for diǎn cha. So this popularizes that form. Oddly enough, it's that form that ends up carrying on to the creation of actual teapots later during the Ming period, where you have this sort of curvilinear form of a spout. So same reason, pours very nicely. What we see, what he's doing though, if we kind of do a top-down look into the tea bowl, is he's trying to reproduce a very beautiful foam on this, what is probably a bai cha, certainly a cake tea, that he had ground down into a powder, and now he's trying to produce a lustrous foam. So, to kind of give you a sense of not only what people were looking for in terms of that foam, but also why they really, really like diǎnware. That picture is this bowl. We have Sai Xiang, who said in his Cha Lu, the tea is of light color and looks best in black cups, like this diǎnware. The cups made at Jianyang, which is where diǎnware is from, are bluish black in color, marked like the fur of a hare. Being of rather thick fabric, they retain the heat. Fabric, I think, is like the construction, so fabrication. They retain the heat so that when once warmed through, they cool very slowly. And they are additionally valued on this account. None of the cups produced at other places can rival these. Sai Shang was a tea person. He was a charan. He was also one of the notable scholars and calligraphers of his time during the mid-Song period. And he wrote extensively in his Cha Lu, the record of tea, about the production of tea, about the whipping of tea, about the sort of products around tea, all geared towards the appreciation of tea. So a bunch of tea nerds, basically. Any questions? Because if you thought we went off the deep end, we're going to go off the deep end now. So, okay. For those,
it's the literati themselves getting involved in the making of tea. Like,
yeah.
I mean, you also go to the previous slides to show you how the tea making on the board, and now they're making it themselves.
They're beginning to, or they're having people make it, and they're admiring it. So there's a close connection between the literati class and the crafts people, as there have been for centuries, but it gets very close during the Song period, to the point where you have people who are actively collecting and actively commissioning pieces. But that's not only limited to teaware, it's also extends to tea. Sai Shang was actually additionally important beyond being just a person who appreciated tea. He was somebody who also commissioned and developed new styles of tea production, different cakes. He was I think his claim to fame is that he produced the Celadon Feng Tuan Chan, the sort of small dragon phoenix tea cake, amongst other things he did. So, but to answer your point, I think by this point they are beginning to make their own tea, certainly in a way that we might today. So, any other questions?
Did everybody grind their own tea, or did they buy it powdered?
That's a good question. My guess is that given how difficult it was to grind tea, you'd probably have someone grind tea for you. I don't know if these guys were actually grinding tea on their own. In terms of wanting to get the best flavor out of your tea. As I've learned through experimenting, you want to grind the tea as soon or as close to when you're drinking it. So chances are is if they are buying the tea pre-powder, it was ground for them at that moment. So yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but if you were well off enough, you would have the écoupage and you would have it ground for you right before you drink it. So this is kind of my loose how-to on grinding Solemn period tea. This is the version that I have been experimenting with. This is the version that I'm doing on my shoestring tea grinding budget. I'm going to preface that because what we saw before, and we can sort of zip back to here, is we want one of these, right? The actual drum grinder. Nowadays, to find one of these can cost you anywhere between $1,500, $3,000 starting price. If you're lucky, you can get a really small one, but the smaller ones don't actually grind the tea as well because you need the heft of it. What we're trying to do when we grind tea is to get tea into a particulate that is anywhere between 8 to 10 microns. So ceremonial matcha is at 1 to 5 microns. All right, very, 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 very small. And when you get it to that level, it will suspend in water. All right, anything more and it becomes grit at the bottom of a tea bowl or in your mouth. So, but again, this is something that we're probably seeing more, this drum grinder, we're probably seeing more of in the late Solemn, like mid to late Solemn. Don't quote me on this, but what I am guessing as what you would find previously is a lot of that rolling grinding going on, and then also using a mortar and pestle. So I took that side of it and played with that. So what we'll see here is Crazy Scott's version of how to grind your own tea if you don't have one of those drum grinders. First few steps, if you did have a drum grinder, you could follow. The idea behind having a drum grinder is that you want to get it down to as fine as possible before you actually put it into the grinder, because you're going to end up grinding it and regrinding it again. What we have here is a white tea. This would be, I think I have it here. This is a Baimudan. I'm going to pass this around just so you can see it in its raw form, or we can be crazy and do this. So this is a Baimudan. I'm going to pass it around with the mortar and pestle so you can see how it feels, how it looks. This mortar and pestle is of a food grade variety that you would find in most, traditional Japanese kitchens. They use this to grind up, often used to grind up sesame seed to make gomai, which is a paste made of sesame seed. It's very tasty. And I purchased it with the initial intent for using it for that, but ended up using it as a means to experiment with tea. So start with the leaves, whole leaves, begin to loosely and softly kind of pat them down. This begins the initial, I'm not going to call it grinding, but sort of the breaking of the tea leaves. After which you begin to remove twigs, of which you'll find quite a few. You'll also want to remove any bits of tea leaves that are just not really anything you want to put into this final powder. Mind you, if this was during the Solemn period, before this start with the loose leaves, you would have a cake. So imagine you have that white tea cake that we started off with. Those are the same leaves. You'd break off a piece of that. You would take a hammer and you'd start banging that, so basically breaking it apart. And then you would begin to grind it down. If it was during the Tang period, you would maybe even use a roasting of these tea leaves or a slight steaming of them to kind of reactivate oils in them. This is not what's going on here. So After which, when you're able to grind it into a fine powder, you want to sift out larger particles. I would say close to half of the tea leaf mass will end up being thrown out because they're just not things that will grind down. When you look at the production of Japanese green tea for matcha, they start off with what's called tencha, and that's kind of a gyokuro grade green tea grown under shading. And what they use is they'll take those leaves and they'll eviscerate them. So take out the stems, take out the veins, and what you're left with is just these sort of flakes of green leaf. So that's when you're doing the first sifting, even the first sorting, you're kind of pulling out the harder bits of a tea leaf and setting them aside. Next, you'll continue to grind, and at this point, once you have all of the hard mass out of it, you'll begin to see these sort of tea hairs emerge, this sort of fur or sort of silvery hair from the young bud of the tea. And you'll continue grinding to the point where it gets finer and finer and finer. I've gotten it to the point where the particles themselves almost begin to have an electrical charge because you're grinding them so much. So you'll take this little wooden mallet and kind of move it around, and it will kind of move with the, it's kind of weird. You'll keep grinding, and I grind these to the point where I'm no longer using the grinder, but I'm just using a piece, like what do we call it, a porcelain bowl. So it's literally just the mallet or the pestle against the porcelain. So the tea itself is helping to grind the tea. And even at that point, you're still getting these little white furry pellets. It looks weird, but you'll begin to see it. And then it will get to the point where it's actually consumable. And for the time being now, the only way that I know that it's consumable is that I've actually tested it to the point where I'll whip up a bowl of tea and figure, is this worth drinking or not? A lot of this is trial and error still. If I had one of those drum grinders, it would be the same thing. I would keep grinding to the point where it was consumable. And even still, every time I do this for a different tea, it could be even tea made within the same region, I find that the effects of producing and the method of producing vary slightly. Each tea is very, very different. For somebody who has grown up drinking loose leaf tea, and then deciding one day, well, I'll just break the leaves. That was probably the hardest part for me because breaking the leaves is like sacrosanct. You don't want to do that. Or it's sacrilege, sorry. So, you know, it's still a work in process. And still hopefully trying to find progress in that process. Eventually though, what you'll want to get is, and what we'll try to get tonight, is a fine enough powder that it is suspendable in water to the point where you get that foam. And we'll see that some of the teas want to do that, some of the teas don't want to do that. Honestly, I think it's due to the presence or lack of sort of tea oil in the tea, because that helps to kind of froth it up a little bit, but we'll see. So
I know it sounds barbarian, but
please.
Have you tried to use the coffee grinder, for example?
No.
Just to see how it tastes if
You wouldn't get it small enough.
well, then, so no, it's not still.
Even at its smallest, a coffee grinder I don't think would get anywhere closer to what we'd get with
We
this.
start with that.
You could start with that. The problem is, and I'm only citing what I've read from either people who have tried to grind their own matcha or from people who do grind their own matcha, is that the metal can cause overheating, and we want to avoid that. So, yeah. And if you try to do it, it works. I want to taste it. So, yeah. So that's it for History in a Bowl of Tea. At least the presentation, PowerPoint presentation component of it. What I want to do now is actually make some tea, because because we're probably all thirsty. I know I am.
That smells so good.
It smells like tea, right?
Oh my
Yeah.
god.
Should we pass it around so people can
Yeah, you
smell?
didn't nobody smell. You didn't smell it.
Should we put some lights on, or do we need lights on? Does it show up?
You tell me.
Okay. Are you guys cool with tea in the dark? Tea after dark? So what we're going to do now is, it's going to kind of be a little bit of a refresher of what we just talked about. We probably need one more teacup, unless, Lainey, if you want to drink out of a tea bowl, you're more than welcome to. Maybe I will too. What we're going to do now is kind of begin Tea 101 with Song period tea. And that is, I'm going to kind of introduce you to some of the wares like we just did, but put them in the context of the physical ware. But we'll also begin to look at how to actually make tea. For those of you who are used to making matcha at home or have seen Japanese tea ceremony, a lot of this is going to kind of lean towards that, partially because that's what I was studying in terms of whisk tea preparation. So I don't have the one-for-one version of song tea in front of me. I guess what we'll do is begin. What's that? Do you want a little cup, or if you want, you can drink out of a large bowl. Okay. So, if you all want to gather around, or I can come to you, whichever. What we'll start with is, I guess we'll start with the tea bowl. And we've already seen this tea bowl, so we'll start with another tea bowl, one we haven't seen. We now, at this point, should know how to make our own tea. We take our tea leaves, we grind our tea leaves, we grind our tea leaves, we grind our tea leaves. Each one of these little containers, which is probably filled down to there, is the result of an hour to 2 to 3 hours of grinding tea. So, usually late at night, because there's better things to do during the day. As I said during the presentation, is a lot of this was coming through a form of trial and error. What we'll get from that is a tea that is palatable, I would say. I think they're yummy. But I'll take your word for it. Let's put it that way. What I pulled out of this bag right now is, and I'm going to use this as kind of our main tea bowl for the night because it's a spouted ware. This is kind of in Korea we would call this a sukwool, which is a spouted server. Japanese is katakuchi, it just means open mouth. I don't know what you'd call this in Chinese. Probably a gondabe of some version. It's just a fair cup, so a serving cup. We'll make tea in this and then we'll serve them in bowls. And I think, do we have enough bowls for everyone? We have 4 bowls, so if you guys want to drink from tea bowls tonight, you can. I want to pass around this bowl. I had made mention of Longchan, which is one of the famous kilns of the Song period, and they're known for this sort of bright green to apple green to like white green to olive green ware. And what you're holding in your hand is a Yuan period, so like 1200s, 1300s tea bowl. This one was made in the Li Tran Dynasty of Vietnam. How we know it's a Vietnamese bowl versus a Chinese bowl is that if you turn it upside down, you'll see a brown foot, or what a lot of collectors will call a chocolate foot, because it's that sort of creamy chocolate color. And what you see along the side is an incised pattern of what is most likely a lotus leaf. Again, tea and Buddhism have a very, very strong and long connection. So it's not uncommon to see things that are Buddhist themed in tea. Nor is it that uncommon to see things that are, floral to begin with, because tea is a flowering plant. But this is definitely a lotus. This would have been made for either local market within Vietnam, but also very likely it could have been made to be shipped to China or to other areas within sort of the Chinese sphere of influence where tea was also being consumed. Wares like this oftentimes make their way to Japan. Sometimes they're called anamyaki for that reason. It just means Vietnam ware or Vietnam ceramics. Because again, it's tea people appreciating teaware. I love this tea bowl, and I think we're gonna make some tea with this tea bowl. So we can do that. Okay. I'll put this to the side for the time being. We'll do our first dou cha with this, or our first diǎn cha, forgive me. And if anybody wants to drink from it, I'm 100% okay with that. I'm actually going to use this now that I think, because it makes more sense, because I can serve it to you guys. But if anybody wants to drink from that, I'm not going to stop them. Okay. Just know that you and probably hundreds of other people have drank from this tea bowl. Those hundreds of other people, though, are probably long gone, because this has always been a tea bowl. So, as have these, as of this. So, part of the fun. Before I jump into tea specifically, again, I want to kind of just show you wares. First off, I want to pass around some reproduction wares, and then we'll get into some of the actual wares. This is, if you peek inside, it's a tea caddy. I'm putting loose leaf teas in here. The tea that is in here right now is a 1980s shui xian. Maybe we can drink some of this later tonight after this is all done. Who knows? What I want to show with this, though, is that it's the container itself is carved in the style of the Song, probably Southern Song period. This is what's called, I'm going to blank on the Chinese name. It means, it's a dao qi. Dao qi literally just means cut qi or cut lacquer. But the style that they're doing here, and what you saw during the Song period, is the emergence of a style where they take layers of lacquer and apply that over an object, or really build the object out of layers of lacquer. Chinese lacquer itself doesn't use necessarily a base to cover. Like a Japanese piece of lacquer would take like something like this and then cover it in lacquer. Chinese lacquer a lot of times is just the piece, and it's lacquer through and through. They sometimes make a mold and then work their way around that. What we see here, though, is a natural form. This is in the shape of a red date. But what we see incised on it is lacquer put layer upon layer, red and black lacquer. So red layer, black layer, red layer, black layer. And then an artisan, a skilled artisan, has come in and cut away at the lacquer to produce these sort of foliate kind of forms that we see here. The shape, or the sort of stylized form that we see on this, is interlocking bats and linger mushrooms, which are these sort of mushroom, the sort of cloud mushroom of Chinese mythology, but also pharmacopoeia. And that's what we see there. They're both, linger and bats are both seen as auspicious symbols for long life and for good fortune. And in that you see that. What's really cool about this too is that when they cut through the lacquer, because it's layered, what you're seeing there is the underlayers being exposed. And so you get this sort of striky effect on that. And it's really during the Song period that this style begins to refine. I'm certain they were doing this during the Tang period as well, but maybe late Tang. But it wasn't until the Song period that you really saw the refinement of this. And if you want to really overgeneralize the Song period, it was taking this very strong foundation of both tea and art that was set during the Tang period and refining it. So we see that in teaware, we see that in the production of tea, we see that in painting, we see that in all other forms of art. And it's also for that reason that today many collectors of art, teaware, etc. end up wanting to collect Song period pieces because they do reflect this high level of refinement. The next thing I want to pass by, this also has tea in it. This is an incense jar, but you would also see jars like this being used for tea, powdered tea, as well as cosmetics and various other things. They're just a jar. But this one specifically is meant for incense, so I like to put tea in it. This is a Korean Celadon piece, but it is influenced by the sort of popular styles and forms from the Song period. Korea during this time was highly renowned for their Celadons and continued to be so for hundreds of years after that. This is a Goryeo style Celadon, and you know that because of not just the sort of form that it's taking, this very kind of abstract jar form, flat abstract jar form, but also what we see here is incising and then filling of the clay with colored glaze. So, and that's a form that you also see in some Chinese kilns, but it's definitely more popular in Korea at this time. What we see there are probably chrysanthemum, it looks like. So, the tea that's in there is a pour from probably the early 90s. So,
you said this is Shuisen?
yeah, that's an aged Shuixian from the 1980s. And then I'm going to pass around. We have another tea container. I won't pass this around because it's filled with matcha, and I don't want anybody to be the person who discovers that out the wrong way. Yeah. I remember one time I had a housemate who found out that I had a bunch of matcha in a not so great way. She's like, "What's in this jar?" So,
What used to be in this jar?
yeah, what used to be in this jar? Oh, just a lot of tea. Yeah. It was before a lot of people were drinking matcha, so they were like, probably thought it was something else. I don't know what else, but what I can share with you too, and again, it's filled with tea. I tend to keep my teawares as teawares. This is a tea caddy from the Northern Song period, so probably 10 or 1100s. What I want you to see here is not just the shape, it's beautiful. It has a slight sort of upturn as you make your way from the foot to the top, kind of opens outward. But I also want you to take a look at the top of the lid and the side of the lid, because on the top of the lid you'll see incised in this, or maybe even pressed into it. It's probably pressed. Use a mold or stamp that they would use to make this. There's a dragon on the top, kind of emerging from a cloud, and then on the side you have this little sort of mushroom, linger-shaped cloud hanging off on the side. I'll let you guys pass that around again. Super careful with that one, but that was a gift to me from a Korean art collector, antique collector.
So it's not a reproduction, it's original.
That's right. That's right. And it was most likely in a tomb. I'm not going to call it degradation, but whenever you see things that have been buried, they tend to have this slight softness to them. But then again, a lot of wares that we see come from tombs. And that is a white tea that's inside. One that I use to grind. This is probably Ge Yao. The Ge kiln was, again, one of the famous kilns of the Song, known for their kind of milky white, creamy white glazing that you see here. And then I'm going to show you one more tea container. This is, I'm not going to call it a reproduction. It isn't from the Song period, so in that sense, it is a piece that is tipping its hat to what we would see coming from the Song. But what I like about it too is that it really encapsulates what not only the Song means to tea, but also how the Song period continues to mean a lot to tea people. You know, for those who like Song period wares, not everybody is on that boat. What we have here is, this is what we call, in Japanese, this is a piece from Japan, this is what we call a chaire. Chaire literally means the thing that the tea enters, but it means also a tea container. It's wrapped in what is called a shifuku. Shifuku is usually comprised of multiple pieces of silk. In this case, the silk was probably from a jacket of a Buddhist monk or abbot. A lot of times that's the silk that they're using, and then tied with a cord that is also made from silk. The color purple being one that you tend to find in Buddhist garb as well. The shape of this, as we'll see, is what we would call a daikai. Daikai meaning large ocean, and I have a theory why it's called that. But it's wrapped in what's called a nagao shifuku, which is, nagao literally refers to, and you'll see very soon, a long cord. So I'm going to untie this little buddy. I'm not going to do it in the way that they do in tea ceremony. I'm going to just kind of go at it, because I'm not focusing. And then the reason why I bring this out tonight is because this is, in a sense, a reproduction of a Song period tea caddy, because it is. It's just a form that continues to be used as a tea caddy in Japanese tea ceremony. But what's cool about this too, beyond being kind of the Japanese version of a junyao piece, where you have this sort of splash of blue, yellow upon a field that's mostly black, but is actually a very, very deep kind of brown purple. What we have here is the tea caddy that would have been the container in which the first tea seeds from China, Song period China, made their way to Japan. In the, I think it was in the 1100s, it must have been in the 1100s. Myoan Eisai, guy who I mentioned earlier, who helped popularize the drinking of whisk tea in Japan, made his way back from China with a container full of tea seeds, of which he then went to hills of Uji and planted them and began tea production of Song-style tea in Japan. He used a tea container like this, and I don't know, it's just, I think it's really amazing to be able to use something that is still originally meant for tea, still use it for tea, and then also see people continue to reproduce this, fully knowledgeable of its long, long lineage and long, long take and place in history specific to tea. This is one such instance. So if you get it,
So what?
it would normally be ivory. This one I think is either made out of bone or probably resin. Yeah. Underneath though they use gold flake to keep a seal. It's not airtight, mind you. You're only keeping powdered tea in here as long as you need it for. If you look at the very bottom of it, you'll see the mark that you get when you pull a piece of thread or wire to detach the piece of ware from the sort of stump of clay when you're making one of these on a potter's wheel. I don't know if it's luted or not. A lot of these Song period jars, usually larger jars though, or ewers, are luted in that they would take two pieces and actually build them and put them on top of each other. Only in large pieces that you see this. This is a single form, but this is made to the specifications of a Song period piece exactly. So you'll find Celadon period pieces that are just like this, that thin, that light. So normally for powdered tea though. Any questions? Because we're gonna start finally drinking tea. Does anybody have questions?
I forgot.
It's okay. I'm not telling this correctly, so my tea teacher is not, hopefully not watching. If you saw that before I tied it up, the shape was in the shape of a dragonfly. Had little wings on it. You'll see it on my Instagram if you want to repeat that. And the reason why it's in the shape of a dragonfly is because this is oftentimes used in summer. The reference, the name itself, Big Ocean, Dakai, is to one, kind of bring in a sort of sense of coolness into the tea room, because in summer in Japan it gets very hot, summer in New York it's very hot. But what we see as well is that it could also be referring to the sort of wide mouth and wide body of it being a wide ocean, but it could also just reference to the ocean that a Buddhist monk would cross to get from Japan to China, from China to Japan. So a couple of thoughts. So
Probably want the petals to reactivate the honey.
So as I awkwardly plug that back in, we're going to start with drinking some of the teas that I produce, and if we're really not yet blasted, we'll end the night off with like a nice cup of matcha to kind of cleanse our palates from all these experiments that have made you taste right now. What I have here is one of my first experiment teas. This one is by Mudan. This is exactly this leaf that we're seeing here, that we ground up and turned into tea powder, if you want to pass out. And when you look at these tea leaves, what you'll see is a tea that is still very, very green, but interspersed with tea buds. So I'll let you guys see that too. When you smell the tea, you kind of get a sense of, hey, this is still pretty green, and it is. White teas might incur a light oxidation that happens when they're processing it. It's not really forced on the tea, but it does just happen. My theory is that the tea in the sowing period, you know, despite them taking all precautions whatsoever to make sure that it was very, very fresh, there was maybe some byproduct of production that created means for some level of oxidation, though I don't think it was ever intended. I've been in debates with people about this, so we'll see. There isn't anything that points to them actually directly wanting to oxidize the tea, so I'm not going to say that they're trying to. This is a close approximation of what we would find in the sowing mill. We'll try another tea that is an even closer approximation afterwards, but I want you guys just to get a sense of how tea is made and what it will look like. What I'm going to do is we're going to make this tea first within this sort of spouted ware. I like to use about 6 scoops, which is a lot, but I find that maybe because it's not as refined as matcha, or just because, you know, matcha itself is its own thing, you want to, you know, this just kind of requires more. I'm scooping this with a scoop that would have been common, at least shape-wise, within the sowing period. This is a contemporary piece. It's probably about 50 years old. Looks like it's made out of maybe a cedar, maybe a cherry. It has striations in it that indicate that. But the shape, if you want to look at it, it's just a single scoop. Modern day Japanese scoops, of which this is, are oftentimes made out of bamboo. And that was a form that was popular starting in the Song, maybe starting before that too, but in the Song they would have used something like that. But the scoops oftentimes wouldn't have a node, or if they did, the node would appear later. This one has no node, and in terms of Japanese tea ceremony, you find this in the most, the upper tones, the more formal tea settings, which, if you look at the way that they're structured, are actually close to what you might find, at least in sort of a form that would be similar to the Song, or at least incorporating Song period wares. So there's a chance that something like this would have been found in and around the Song. I'll pass this around. Just make sure when you touch it, always touch from the bottom part, never the top. This is for tea, this is for hands. So just do that. As I'm passing that around, I'm going to pass, or I won't pass this around just yet, but I'm going to begin the process of what we would call diǎn cha. Again, the sort of marking of the tea. And what I'm doing first is I'm just wetting the tea scoop. In Japanese tea ceremony, there's a whole method behind this. I'm doing kind of the abridged version. Starting to do in my later version of that presentation that we showed, I might incorporate this. What I'll do is kind of create a slurry first, and in what's called the Chawan Chawan, which was produced by Emperor Song Huizong. He's one of the last emperors of the Song, certainly the last emperor of the Song before it broke down into the southern Song. He writes about how to make tea in his treatise on tea, the Chawan Chawan. And he talks about 7 steps, or the 7 sort of points for making this style of tea. And what he means by that is that you introduce water into the tea at 7 points. The first is just to kind of wake the tea up, mix it into a slurry, and then subsequent or successive additions of that, you'll begin to whip it into a foam. And if you look at it right now, it's actually beginning to foam. And this didn't happen the very first time I made this tea. First time I made this tea, it was disgusting. And it wouldn't whip into a foam. I'm like, okay, I need to keep at this because I've got something here. And eventually, the more and more I ground the tea, eventually it got to the point where foam would be produced. But I found that doing exactly, or as exact as I could, to what Emperor Song Huizong was describing, actually resulted in this. So, is this the 4th time? So if you can remember that image of the guy who's holding the teacup and he's like doing that, that's what I'm doing right now, sort of.
You're not holding the cup, right?
I'm not holding the cup. I'm not being as fastidious as him. During these docha, what they're trying to do is create a foam, similar again to like these latte art competitions, to the point where they'd actually create designs in them, similar to like a latte art, I guess. But what they're looking for too is to see how long their foam can last. To say that the foam has bite meant that the foam would sort of resist separating and would remain on the bowl, and that's what we're going to see here. Huizong himself talks about the foam being like a drift of snow. I think that was Huizong. And we can almost think of it as being like it will begin to peak, kind of like a meringue. And if you look at it right now, I'm going to put one more little bit of water in it. Actually, you have tiny versions of this, don't you? There's at least one. And then that one there too, on the bottom. Nope. Middle, yeah. If you want, this is,
No, this one. That's not the one.
whichever, we're gonna play around with 2 ones. So we've added water to this 7 times, and what do you guys see, just out of curiosity?
Nice one.
It's a nice one. It's like microfoam, right? It's not like no big bubbles. If there are big bubbles during the last whisking, I'll do kind of a light, high whisk. So I'm just whisking the foam, and at the very end I'll pull up, and there's like a little peak to the foam. Do you guys want to drink out of bowls, out of cups?
Sure. Sorry.
If we'll start with cups, and then if anybody wants a whole bowl, I'll do that. This is just a taste.
Are there instructions on water temperature?
They talk about water a lot in Chinese tea texts, and they talk about water wanting to ripen, as well as the points at which you want water to boil. So when you're boiling water, you're waiting for the appearance of water boiling as if it were kind of like I call it like steam will be like silk threads. The sound it produces will be like wind rushing through the pines. They use a lot of poetic terms. The presence of crab's eyes is another thing, like the size of the bubble. So that's a lot of fun. What you'll find in this, and again, thank you for coming here in my early stages of my tea experimentations. There is still a little bit of sediment with this. You'll find this was one of the earlier iterations that I had with tea, so it's still a little on the rougher edge. But I don't want to offend you with the tea sediment. It is tasty, but it can be slightly bitter.
Thank you.
If you've had nice matcha, you will know that there's always a little bit of sediment that comes with it. If you do like any of these teas, I want to make a bowl of that tea for you, so we'll start just by tasting these. So. What do you think? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm.
Is it just me again?
No. Actually, it must be
Last
just
time
you.
he was
Yeah, you might.
new to me.
Did everybody get a wee bit of the tea? Sediment? What did you think of the liqueur of the tea, though? Was it? Yeah.
Definitely doesn't taste like steeped in the same
No,
tea.
no.
Quite floral.
Yeah. Quite floral?
Yeah, flowery,
Yeah.
floral.
No.
Drinking this side by side with the whole leaf, as you probably have done, what would
Mhm.
you say are the differences?
We can do that, and actually, that brings me to this point. I brought a gaiwan, and the gaiwan is made in the Song style. But we can make some of this tea right now, just so that we can try it side by side. This is a Real Celadon. Gaiwan themselves didn't come about really until the Ming period, but prior to that, if you can imagine, the thing that it's sitting on is more or less this little sort of foot that it likes to sit on. The bowl is in the center, of course, it's this thing here. And it wouldn't be uncommon during the Song period to have a lid when giving a bowl of tea. The only difference between this being something from the Song period to being something from the Ming period is that during the Ming period, this becomes something to brew tea in, whereas during the Song period, it would have been something to present tea or to drink tea out of, already made. So slightly different. But we'll do some side-by-side comparison. This is Baimuda.
Were they using just plain water at this point?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, just boiling water. Though to say plain water at that time, as even to this day, it's like, so does that mean it was spring water? Was it well water?
I previously they
Yeah.
had like salt and
Yeah, they were using just water at this point. That is interesting, though, to ask that too, because when you think of what they were adding to tea at this time, during the early Song period, and Cai Shang talks about this. This is the guy who wrote the record of tea, the Cha Lu. He talks about people putting incense into tea. I was actually thinking of doing that tonight, but it's kind of, I tested it, it's kind of gross. They use a camphor oil or camphor wood. It's a little intense, and maybe I was doing it wrong, or maybe they just liked their tea kind of weird. They were also doing a lot of flower tea and tea scented with flowers. So, you know, the Song period was still very much a time when people were experimenting with tea, still trying to feel it out. Even the cakes themselves would come, if they were like really fancy cakes, they would come in boxes wrapped in silk, wrapped in, you know, with incense inside, or scented with flowers. So, you know, that would certainly be absorbed by the tea. So, yeah, you know, the water itself may have been pure, but at this point they were just beginning to add stuff to it. Cai Shang talks about how people do this, but he also talks about how it's better just to have the tea on its own. So, like Lu Yu, he's a bit of a purist, so enjoy. What do we think? How does it, is there a similarity, or? A little bit of that
A
floral
little
pit?
similarity.
Yeah.
It's good.
Much more mellow.
The sweetness from
Mm-hmm.
it.
Yeah, the polymorph is more concentrated, very concentrated.
Yeah.
Kind of this
Yeah.
flavor.
And I think from the second steep and cold, this will be even more different.
Yes. We can do a second sip. We'll drink this in between each tea.
Wash them out.
Clean the palate. And again, we're using a tea that really didn't exist during the Song. Modern white tea. The next tea that we'll brew, I'm tempted to brew, is one of my more recent experiments. How are we on time, by the way? I just want to make sure.
8:30.
8:40? 8:40? Okay, we'll do a few more. Let's brew the green tea that this is actually using a Zhejiang green tea. Sorry, it's in Tupperware. It's like super Song Dynasty.
They were ahead of their time.
Put it away. It's like the only time I've ever used Tupperware, and here I am doing it during this.
You run out of
Yeah.
beautiful.
No, I didn't run out. I was like trying to keep them separated. I did keep them away from light as much as I could. So. Tupperware is a terrible thing to store tea in, by the way, because plastic has a tendency to off-gas and exchange gas. So if it wasn't in there for more than as long as it's been in there, which has been like 20 hours, maybe less, I made it last night, you know, I wouldn't keep it in there longer than that. Alright, so I'm going to play around with some Zhejiang green tea now. The reason why I'm making an emphasis on Zhejiang is that Zhejiang was one of the major tea producing areas.
Do you know what's
A little bit, maybe. Zhejiang was a major tea producing area during the Song, and it continues to be a major producing area for green teas predominantly. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just warming the vessel. One of the things that you hear in the Chawan Tea is that you want to warm your vessel when you're seeing tea produced in tea bowls like this. Often is the case that you warm the vessel as well. So.
discussing how the tea tasted.
Yeah.
So like, what are the terms they use?
A lot of times they're saying sweet. A lot of times they're referencing the floral notes that you'll get. Wish I had written some down because there are some that speak quite on end about that. So, I'll make a list, and it will be present on her Facebook page within a day or two. Because no, this is when people begin to really wax poetic about tea in a way that had rarely been done before. But yeah, a lot of it is saying it tastes of, beautiful spring waters or flowers, or but again, it tends to be very poetic.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, or it tends to remind them of something. So.
Good.
Mm. just like diǎn.
Yeah.
It's very good.
I don't think we're gonna sleep tonight.
This is why I was doing this late at night.
Big gun?
What's that?
Is it big gun?
Yeah. I think I'm gonna do one more of these teas because
Of this?
none of this. No, one more of my experiment.
Oh, yeah, no, well, let's try one then.
Okay. Sure thing. I have one more white tea that I've produced. I was doing it in different batches, so.
The same way we're done?
No, it's different.
Different?
I have a cake. I don't know. I was breaking down. It's a fooding by Chawan. Aged, I think it's like 9 years old. But then I also have a oolong that I was using, which. What is this one?
Mixer?
It's very good. So I'm tempted to make that right now, if you're okay with that. And then we'll round it off with some more white tea, and then maybe make some matcha if you guys really need more.
You really don't want to sleep.
Yeah. So again, this is a super experiment. Tea like this would not have existed during this time period. What I'm doing is I'm applying a method of making Celadon style tea to an oolong, in this case a diǎn cha, and it's being grown in the region where Celadon period tea would have been grown. So that's its only claim to being anything close to a Celadon period tea. What's nice about it though is I think it actually tastes interesting and yummy. So I'll let you guys be the ultimate judge of that.
The green has nice aftertaste, though.
Yeah. There's a lot of times in tea literature discussion of flavor, and a lot of it comes. Yeah, if you guys want to smell this is
Oh, I can. You smell?
If you want, that's
And it's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like super intense compared to what you normally get. So.
Cake.
Yeah. It's like a yummy biscuit or something. Yeah. Production of oolong. So again, this is an oolong. This is a higher oxidized oolong. That would not have occurred until really the late Ming period. But would have begun pretty much in Fujian, pretty much in Yishan and Anqi, areas that are known for
Do
this.
you know what made them kind of do it more oxidized and more roasted lately? Is it
Why they did it? I think part of it was because it made it taste interesting. When you oxidize a tea like black tea, or not black tea, but hong cha, red tea, it's a fully oxidized tea and it's very robust and it has an interesting flavor. When you catch it midway, those flavors are robust, but they're also very floral, in a way that you'd find in, let's say, like a Phoenix oolong, or in some of these are going to be more incense-like. But I think it was led by that. I think there's part of it might also be preservation of tea flavor, but if that's what you're doing, if you're oxidizing a tea, you're not really preserving a flavor, you're changing it. So I think was driving it.
I bet though the deep oxidation happened before because you need to prevent it from happening. So,
Yeah.
but they are not kind of like.
No, it's like even we get into this conversation with people who ask like, you know, how do you prevent oxidation? Doesn't it just naturally occur? And it does.
It does, yeah.
Like the minute you pick a tea, like a tea leaf, and then put it in your basket, and then you know, bring that down from the mountain, it's gonna oxidize. Like the more distance between you from when you pick that to the point where you know, either steam it as they were doing, or roasting it, or you know, shachi, sort of pan roasting it. It's going to be in some form oxidizing. So.
When they were, as you said, mashing them into like a pulp to make into the cake, at what point was that? You know, right after picking, or after they may have steamed or slightly roasted it?
Yeah, it was right around after they were finished steaming.
After that, correct? Because it seems like if you would do that, it would increase more oxidation.
Yep. Yep. Wash your teeth. Meantime, we can watch this foam stick to it.
Well, technically the grinded tea is the taste as you would chew on a leaf,
Bit.
right?
Bit, yeah. The suspending it in water, like what we're doing right now, produces a sort of lighter, airier flavor, but yeah. You're eating the tea leaf, so.
Because I did chew the green tea before.
Yeah. Well, the whole thing, I mean, one might say that the history of tea began when people started chewing on tea leaves. Similar in a sense to like how somebody would chew cocoa. So, get a lot of that yummy tea dust in that one. There we go. I'm happy to make more of this one because there's more of it. I do know as it successively continues. It's I think you and I may have gotten more of the tea dust in this, so I can make more.
Again, it's very different.
Yeah. do you think?
It's funny.
Oh.
Not to be rude, but it
No.
tastes like coffee.
Like coffee. Yeah. 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 Well, it's kind of roasty like
Is it
coffee.
because roasted?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's because
Yeah.
it's roasted.
I've tried doing this with other oolongs, and I find that at least from my experiments, the older style oolongs, so oolongs that are twisted rather than rolled, tend to perform better. So there was one time I was making the fun pandas home, and it worked, and then the first time I made it, it didn't work. So I don't know what was up.
How many different teas have you tried?
About 10, and maybe, yeah.
Are you
about 10.
trying to go in?
Yeah. I haven't gotten it yet. I think part of it is that roasting creates a little bit of, I don't know if it's like, it's almost like caramelization.
Yeah.
And when they caramelize like that, it becomes harder to break them down. But again, I think I'm slightly limited by the fact that I'm using a mortar and pestle. So if I had the thing, it might not be that case. I know people who have used, there are other people who experiment with this in a similar way, some of whom have used the actual stone mill for this, and it looks like they're succeeding, you know. So I think I still have a long way to go in terms of reproducing this, but it's interesting to see what flavors are present that you wouldn't necessarily find if you were doing it this way. You also learn a lot about the tea leaf by grinding the tea, like doing it by hand. You learn every little viscera of a tea leaf, how it differs from a white tea to a green tea to a, this oolong versus that oolong, red teas. And it's interesting because you also begin to see how some of them are actually quite similar. Like some of the white teas that I ground are actually very similar to some of the red teas that I've done this to. So, with similar results, and that you can produce an interesting foam. So, I would make maybe one more white tea for you guys, if that's all right. And then, again, if you want to have some matcha, we can always have some matcha too. So.
I know postcard teas in London have just released some stone ground teas.
They have?
Yeah.
What specifically?
I think there's an oolong, might be an Earl Grey.
Okay.
And there's matcha. But I think they do them as like a latte.
Yeah. Like a matcha latte kind of thing.
Yeah, but it's not got any sugar or any extras in it.
Yeah. Do you know who's doing that specifically?
They're called postcard teas.
Postcard, okay.
Kind of one of the best shops in London.
Yeah.
Write that down. Go there in August.
Oh, nice.
What I'm doing now for those who've had different types of matcha, if you've had koi cha, which is like the thick version of that sort of like light and fluffy version of matcha, which is called usu cha. Koi cha you begin making by doing what I'm doing right now. That's taking the tea powder, which you then add a little bit of water, and then you kind of knead into a thick paste, and that aids in the sort of dissolving of the tea into the liquid, so it comes out even.
So most of the tea which was grind at that period was matcha, right? They would like matcha, the raw tea.
It was a little bit more than that. Matcha is just literally just picked tea leaves and dried. Yeah. These would have been steamed. And then these would have been certainly of a much higher grade than what we'd see in most matcha or malcha. Malcha, what we see today.
So you're saying that they would do more than that before they grind?
Yeah.
Like shaping, bruising, something like this? Or?
No. It was mostly steam. And a lot of sorting. And that would just be for the nicer cakes. You know, if you're talking about the stuff that was going out to Tibet and to the tea horse road, it wasn't, from what I've read, was not that great of tea. It was very rough. So that would be a lot more like mantra.
So when the diversification of the 6 types, which is now recognized, Dynasty happened?
Around the late Ming, early Qing. Yeah. White tea would have been, what is that, Qing? So really Qing. So in the 6,000 years of tea history, what we know is tea. Yeah. What we know as tea really didn't come about until like last, like 250 years, 300 years. Maybe a little bit more.
This is the best.
Yeah.
It always smells like incense.
Like ginseng? Yeah.
So is it also white,
Also white tea.
but not a binder?
Not a bind.
It's
No.
aged,
No.
aged.
It's slightly, yeah, this one I think was coming from the 9-year-old cake. So it's just very, very, very smooth. Certainly the more you grind this on this thing, and then shifting it into like a porcelain, not even a grinder, just a porcelain bowl, the finer and finer it gets. So it's just like, how much time do you want to spend doing that? But this one was one of the first, actually I think it was the first time that when I was making this style of tea, I realized that it could be done using this method.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that, it was too heavy, and for some reason, white teas grind the easiest. Like for some reason, I don't know. I think there's something to do with either the younger tea leaves or just the natural sweetness that comes in. They tend to thicken up a little bit easier. Though at the same time, you have a lot of those tea hairs that come out. Like again, when you want to talk about like how much you're actually casting aside, you end up casting much more white tea, like from white tea aside than you do any other tea. So, are there any other teas that you guys wanted to like have again, or I have a matcha that was stone ground here in New York City. If you guys really want to go to the moon. So I could make some of the Fengguan Dancong that I made, but I don't think it's ready yet. Like I made one version and it worked, and that was enough for like a bowl of tea, and I've been trying to reproduce that and it hasn't been ready yet. So I do know it's tasty, it's just not fluffy like this. So
I would try a Shuisen, but we didn't have to.
we can brew some of that if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't have to, but
Okay.
we could another time. It's up to you.
I will say, if I'm going to continue this historical series, the next one that I'd like to do is history, historically speaking, working on history in the Ming. And during that, I would definitely bring that tea back. That tea I have very, very, very little of. And it's getting to a point where I need to like hide it away from myself. But when we do that, what I'd like to do is talk about the evolution of teaware during the Ming, because it is during the Ming that we begin to see, like we stop seeing tea bowls. We start seeing gaiwan. We start seeing gaiwan being used as tea brewing devices rather than as cups where we drink tea from. It's also during the Ming period that we begin to see things like teapots. It's the emergence of the teapot, and as sort of as we had made mention, this shape, though this is not the most beautiful shape, sorry, Bon Vita, but the shape where we have a handle and where we have a spout, we all know the song. It is during that time period that we do start seeing that. So
For brewed tea.
for brewing tea inside of it, yeah. Prior to that, of course, you would potentially have people pouring tea out of that. Even if you go to like Tibet today, you see butter tea being served in large, teapots. But it wasn't until the Ming period that you started seeing the brewing, really the sort of, I won't call it standardization, but sort of the beginnings of what we can call recognizably gongfu cha occurring in that time period. And it is during that time period, to sort of touch back on what Lane said, it is during that time period that we start seeing the emergence of the 6 sort of classes of tea. What is it? The green, white, yellow, red, oolong, hei cha. There's more than 6 really. I mean, there's like but we can go on a lot more about that certainly. But I would love to do a thing focused on that, similar in a way that we did here. But I think what we saw, or at least I hope you guys saw, with the Song period is, one, it's a period where we're beginning to enjoy tea for tea's sake. It's like, let's just sit and talk tea or drink tea. Let's do so in a way where the wares themselves are tea, teawares. Certainly during the Tang period you had teawares, certainly even before then you would have had teawares, but it's during the Song period that you have wares that are now being made in a multitude of different ways that are made for the appreciation of tea in a way that had never been done before. And then you also just have, you know, I don't know how many tea caddies I have in my collection, most of which are Song style. And that's because during the Song period, you do have the tea aficionado who's going out there who has either the money or the clout or both, and the influence to create a collection. And I think it's during that time period that you start seeing that in a much wider and much more, let's say, diverse and interesting way. Tang Dynasty had people doing that, but during the Song you see an explosion of that. And it is also during the Song period that we began to see tea move even further outside of China, to Japan, to Korea, along the Tea Horse Road, to Vietnam, but to the point where those places are now beginning to create their own tea culture. It is still in reference to certainly China in many ways, but at the same time they begin to do their own thing too.
But not Europe yet.
Not in Europe yet.
Yeah,
Not in Europe yet. It is during the Ming Dynasty, very, very late Ming Dynasty, that we began to see that, and that is something that I do want to talk about. And if you ever want to see Scott go off the deep end, I will bring out another PowerPoint presentation. That
Portugal?
Well, it starts with Portuguese, yeah. So you have the Portuguese, and then you have, like, what is it, the court of Catherine, who brings it over to England, but it starts with Portuguese. It then moves to the Dutch. It then moves to the English, and those are kind of the three. Really, the Portuguese are kind of doing their own thing, but it's the Dutch who do, in a similar fashion to how, like, during the Song period, I would say, to make an analogy, they're a worldwide empire at the time of the early 1600s, mid 1600s, and it coincides with what's called the Dutch Tea Craze. And that's when you have people from the Dutch Republic going to China, specific places in China, Fujian, Canton, and picking up on local tea culture there and bringing bits of it back to the Netherlands. One is Yixing teaware, one is blue and white ware. The tea that they bring back is largely black tea, hei cha, because it can be on a ship. It can travel well. So in a sense, it's kind of like, and this is going to be my stretch for the night, but in the Song period, we have a foundation of tea culture already established in China, and a lot of it is on the southwest side of China. It doesn't yet reach the east until late Tang, and that's really just around like Suzhou and Zhejiang. But it's during the Song period that it becomes kind of universally Chinese. It expands across what we can call recognizably China, even including parts of Tibet and parts of Central Asia. And they elaborate on these forms, and places like Fujian, which really hadn't had a developed tea culture, began to really take charge of that. It's kind of in a way that, like, let's consider China at this time like a colonial entity, in a way that we can call, like, the Dutch Republic a colonial entity. A culture will spark somewhere, and then it will somehow make its way to other parts of that world, and it does so through government, and it does so through scholars and merchants and religion. And those are kind of the arms of, colonial powers throughout history. teas travel very well in a colonial model, as we've seen time and time again. So that's my stretch for the night.
Are they mostly having it powdered during this time?
What's that?
They're mostly having it powdered all over, or was it still steeped?
So in the Song period, it was mostly powdered within certain echelons of society. If you went out to, let's say, the countryside, my guess is what they were doing is they're still using the bricks, breaking off parts of the bricks, maybe grinding it up, and then putting that into a soup. As they do to this day. If you go to parts of Tibet, if you go to parts of Shishwambana, they don't necessarily grind it up as much, but you know, they take a chunk off of a cake and immerse that in water and boil that water. So yeah, not everybody was doing what we did. But this is the style that gets elevated and people write about because they're in that part of society that has the means to write about it, the literate side of society. So that's why we have that. So, yeah. Any other questions? If you guys want any other tea, let me know.
It's okay, I'm good.
You're okay.
I have a lot of energy.
All right, we're ready to go.
Thanks so much. That was really
No,
interesting.
thank you all. Yeah. And again, this is, as always, part of an ongoing series. We also do tea focused. So what we did right now is more history focused, history in a bowl of tea. As I've done here with Floating Mountain Tea House is also sort of tea class focused. So we've done oolongs, we've done Hechan Pu'er. I would love to do one that's focused on green teas and white teas. Maybe throw some yellow teas in there, and then start really digging into maybe like wee teas or fenghuang dancong, getting really even more focused than what we've done before. So the blessing and the curse about tea is that there is way too many out there to just, you know, there's just so much out there. There are thousands of different types of tea. So you can spend a lifetime just tracking, chasing those. But it's always good to put it in the context. At least I think so. So I'm happy to share that with you guys.
Thank you.
So thank you all. Yeah.
It's fun. Do stuff. I don't know.